Hi, everyone. Welcome to our special expert panel discussion this evening. It's 6 o'clock Mountain Time on Monday, April 19th, which is part of our series of events that we are hosting at the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs and the New Mexico Children's Alliance. We are happy to be here live on the Coalition Facebook page. And for those of you who are joining us in the Zoom webinar, welcome as well. We're happy to have you here tonight. My name is Melissa Ewer. I am the director of the New Mexico Children's Alliance, which is an accredited chapter of the National Children's Alliance housed at the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. And I use she, her pronouns. And I will be facilitating our conversation this evening. And I'm so excited that we have so many great professionals from all over the state that are going to share with our audience here tonight, whether you're watching it live with us. Hi, nice to see you. And if you're here watching the recording, we're so glad that you clicked on this video to be able to watch and learn a little bit tonight. So for those of you out there in Facebook land, we're happy that you are here and watching. If you'd like to like our page for the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs or New Mexico Children's Alliance, we would love that. We share a lot of information all throughout the year, but this month in particular, April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, as well as Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so in light of that, we at the Sexual Assault Coalition and the Children's Alliance are happy tonight to bring you our expert panelists who are all professionals here in New Mexico to talk about and give some reactions and resources to the documentary film that's called Rewind, that was created by Sasha Newlinger in 2019. He basically had an experience in his childhood where his family was did a lot of home movies, just like many families do when you're growing up. And Sasha himself was a victim of child sexual abuse from family members, and his sister was as well. So those of you who were able to see the film were, I'm sure, really moved and learned a lot from Sasha's film and the way that he was able to transform this experience that he had in looking at home videos that his father had taken while he was growing up, and then really share and interview some family members and people that had helped him along the way through this experience. So in light of the subject matter tonight, we wanted to also share a resource with you all, because some of the topics that we're discussing tonight might bring up some thoughts and feelings if you yourself have been a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, or if you have family or people close to you. So I just wanted to share right now, here in New Mexico, we're fortunate to have a 24/7 hotline through the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico, located here in Albuquerque. It's a 24/7 hotline, and if you need support, the number is 505-266-7711. That's 505-266-7711. And you should be able to see that in the chat if you're watching us as part of the webinar. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my panelists. As I mentioned before, I'm Melissa Ewer. I'm the director of the New Mexico Children's Alliance. And I'm just going to go right across the screen, and we'll start with Vanessa. Would you like to introduce yourself, Vanessa?
Sure. Thank you for that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Vanessa Frank, and I am a forensic interviewer for Child Haven, which is located in Farmington. However, we do have a satellite office in Gallup, and that is where I am doing my forensic interviewing there at a satellite office in Gallup called Hummingbird CAC.
Thanks, Vanessa. Rebecca, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Reyes. I am a child abuse prosecutor in Bernalillo County. So I prosecute crimes committed against children, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and child deaths in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Thanks, Rebecca. Angelica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angelica Calderon with La Piñon Children's Advocacy Center in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I am the Deputy Director and a Child Forensic Interviewer.
Thanks, Angelica. And Nick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Cedillo. I'm the Clinical Director here at the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico. I'm also a therapist here. And we provide free services to survivors and their family members.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm really excited. We have people from all over the state. Our Children's Alliance has 11 children's advocacy centers, and we also have rape crisis centers all over the state as well, where people in New Mexico who are in need of services or support can access those supports in their area. But let's get right into it. So this was a pretty powerful documentary for a lot of reasons, but I'd like to hear some of your initial reactions watching the film and whether there's moments that stand out for any of you. Anybody want to start?
I think from myself, seeing, of course, the documentary was, even though it's something that we work in, I always say like 24/7, right? Because it's constantly something that we're called out to. Our agency is on call as well, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it's still shocking to see the doctor's response when mom went for help with something was going on with Sasha. And the doctor's response was, you don't want to open this can of worms. We don't want to go there. This could destroy your family. And that's being a victim advocate at heart, right? Where are we protecting the children? Where was Sasha's concern and his safety, and regarding like what could have been going on with him and actually what was going on with him at home. And yet this doctor didn't want to open up that can of worms, right?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And it's probably not all that uncommon, right? Where people are afraid to ask questions sometimes because they're afraid of what the answers might be and not knowing what to do. It's a good observation.
Right, exactly. And I think it's maybe the unknown. Things, of course, have changed and evolved since years ago when Sasha was a child, of course. But just seeing how important the CAC movement is, where the child has to, talk about what happened to them, hopefully in one setting, rather than being interviewed multiple times like Sasha was, speaking to the people at the doctor's place, speaking to law enforcement, all those steps, and having to retell over and over his story. So that also was something that, made me appreciate where we are now. I mean, we still have a long way to go, right? But we've made huge strides in protecting children in our community.
Yeah, I can see that. And so you mentioned just now, you said the CAC movement. So some of our audience members might not know what that means. Could you maybe describe what you mean by CAC or CAC movement?
So the Children's Advocacy Center, right? Previously, a child would disclose and they would have to go to the police station and speak to maybe a detective, or maybe start with a patrol officer, someone in uniform, and then speak with a detective. And then they would be questioned in possibly like a cold interview room, right? Something where maybe suspects are interrogated, bright lights, the double mirror, all that stuff that you might see on TV. And then after that, they might have to go speak with Child Protective Services. So the family would have to go to that office, be interviewed by investigators there. Possibly there's a medical exam that is needed. Then they would have to go to the medical office, speak to a nurse or speak to a medical provider regarding what has happened to that child. And then from there, they would have to get services for mental health services, like psychiatrist or counselor. And they would have to go to that office, where the CAC, all the adults, all the people that are responsible or want to see the best for the children are all under one roof. So instead of the family and the children going to all these different offices at CAC, so I think Melissa, you said we're at 11 now in New Mexico, the Children's Advocacy Centers. The children and their families come to one building, and law enforcement's here, Child Protective Services are here. Sometimes the medical office is in the same building as well. Here at La Piñon, I can speak for, our agency, we have clinicians here that are available if there's a crisis at that moment. When they're coming back for counseling services, it's at the same building. We're all focused on the child and making sure that the environment that they are possibly disclosing, a traumatic event, is focused on, where they're at and meeting the child. Whereas before, the child would have to go through all these other different places, and now all the adults come to the child or children and family.
Yeah, that seems like a big improvement of having to go all over the place and, all the different people involved in trying to help, not communicating or collaborating in the way that they're supposed to. So yeah, it definitely sounds like that's an improvement. Does anybody else want to share their reactions or moments that stand out?
I'll go. I was, when I watched it the first time, I think the thing that really stood out for me was the power behind it, of him kind of reclaiming it and turning it into this documentary, as well as putting his voice out there, because I think a lot of male survivors don't speak out. And so it's a huge deal for him to put his voice out there and put his story out there, so that maybe more male survivors will feel like it's okay for them to come forward and get service. It's okay for them to acknowledge what's happened to them and get the help that they need.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because of all the stigma that goes along with reporting or sharing an experience that's happened like this, that it can be really difficult. And it's empowering, I think, at times for people to speak out, whether it's children describing the experiences that they've had as children, or adults even recounting things that had happened in their past. It can really help to encourage other people to speak out and get the support that they need. So yeah, that's a really good point.
I can go next. My first time watching it, I was a little, I guess you can say, triggered, because as a forensic interviewer, I interview like a lot of kids who dealt the same situation. But I felt like in this one, it was more a cycle. Even the father was being sexually abused, and he didn't come out and disclose any of it until it actually happened to his children. First Sasha and then his sister. And I think it was very brave of him to come out and tell his parents, like, this is something's happening with his sister. And that's when I think they started questioning, and I'm just glad that he's very brave enough to come out and touch on those areas where it's okay to disclose. And I'm sure he's right now, I think he is a presenter in all the in nationwide. And I did have the opportunity to listen on to his presentation 2 years ago at a symposium, and it's very touching, like how he tries to reach out to different CACs and tell them how a CAC is very important for children, instead of like what Angelica was saying, for a child to repeat their stories more than one time. It's too much on a child, rather than a CAC where it's child friendly. They can only tell a story one time. So that's what I kind of felt about the documentary.
Yeah, that's a good point, that even when you're doing this work, that watching a documentary like this and seeing everything that happened and hearing the stories, that it can still have an impact on all of us, and to really see the bravery for what it is, and also just, yeah, that transformational power, like Nick was saying just now, about how someone can take this kind of experience and make a documentary like this that's able to reach so many people and have such an impact. So yeah, it's a really good point. Rebecca, were there things that stood out for you?
So I will say this documentary felt very familiar. To me, it felt like, well, we have come far, we just have so much further to go. We do have CACs, but when it comes to the court system, we are re-traumatizing these kids over and over and over again. We're putting these kids through a forensic interview, a medical. Right now with COVID, we're putting them through a preliminary hearing. They're having to give a pretrial interview, and then they're having to testify at trial. So we don't get to a trial without there being 3 or 4, sometimes 5 statements from that child before we even get to trial. And as they mentioned in the documentary, every single one of those statements is going to be used against that child, because every single time that child speaks, they're going to recall the event a little bit differently. That's just how trauma trauma works on the brain. And so it just reminded me how much further we have to go, and how much, fight there still is left for us to do in trying to protect these kids and ensuring that they truly are only having to talk about this once at the forensic interview, and then never again if they don't want to.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, that, that kids often have to tell their stories over and over and over again. And many children will, experience the system that gets triggered after a report is made, that they're often re-traumatized by that process. And so that's why it's super helpful to have professionals like Nick and others that are there to provide mental health support, advocacy for the families of the kids that are going through this, to be able to help with that. And to remember that even though there are some strides that we've made over time, that there still is work to do, and we're all committed to doing that work. And it's good to be able to work together to do that, and to share these stories with everyone, so that the public is aware, because I think it can be a really isolating feeling and experience if a family is going through something like this, and just not recognizing that it happens to a lot of people. And it's something that people have to deal with, the trauma of what happens after the disclosure, right? And so those are really good points. As far as how things go when there's, obviously in this story, in this situation, we had family members that were committing acts of sexual abuse against kids in the family. So that tends to present some different challenges. And I know that over time, a lot of times we hear about stranger danger, or a lot of times the messaging is around, fearing strangers or people that we don't know hurting our kids. So what are some of the challenges that occur when the person who's committing these acts of sexual abuse against a child, when that person is a member of the child's family? Does anybody want to share some insights on that?
I can start on that. So first off, it makes the disclosure process harder to begin with, because these kids who are being abused often know that once they disclose, it's going to disrupt the entire family dynamics, which it did in this documentary. When Sasha disclosed, it changed the entire dynamics of his family. I mean, his parents ended up divorced. His father was suicidal. There was a lot going on for his family. So we know that that's going to happen. We also always have to be concerned about the safety of the child. So where is this child going to be placed once they do disclose? Are they going to be put back in that home? And that's, I think, always one of our biggest concerns is this child in a safe space after they disclose?
Right. Those are really good points. And I wonder go ahead, Angelica.
Just feeding off of what Rebecca was saying, I think some of the challenges, it just causes a delayed disclosure, right? Because children realize that it could impact the family, right? What if it's someone actually living in the home? Maybe it's the person that pays all the bills or puts food on the table, or maybe it's mommy or daddy's boyfriend or girlfriend or love of their life, and they don't want to hurt mommy or daddy, so they put all that responsibility on their shoulders. So it causes them at times to have a delayed disclosure, and you're finding out about the abuse years later, because they understand, they have that capability to say, it is going to cause a huge rift in my family, in my life, and do I want to do that?
I can add to that too. Just like Angelica said, it's always a late disclosure. I think a lot of the interviews that I do, it happens when they're about maybe before 10 years old, and they're coming in when they're like 12, 15 years old, finally disclosing what happened when they were like 6. I just had a prime example. I interviewed a child last month. It was their suspect was an uncle, and he got a job out of state, and that was when she was finally able to felt comfortable and brave to disclose, because he wasn't in the home anymore. That was when years later. And I feel like it takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery to come forward. And I think there's a lot of fear in it as well.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a good example of a child that might wait until they feel like there's different circumstances in place before they might tell an adult if they feel like, in your situation you were sharing, that the person that was doing this is no longer around, and it felt safer to tell someone. Is this something that you see often, Nick, with people that don't necessarily disclose right when it's happening?
Definitely. I think I would say that's it's probably one of the most common instances when people reach out for a counseling service. It's much delayed. It's adults coming in to address this trauma they experienced during childhood, and they've never told anyone until they're in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, and that's what we're seeing a lot of is that. And then also they're reporting these childhood abuses because they had another assault happen as an adult. So there's these layers of trauma that are happening to people. And I think a lot of that stems like from what everyone else is saying of, just not feeling safe enough to disclose, but even when they do disclose, their family not believing them or not acting on it. And I think that's really important that people, if children are coming forward and saying things, we have to look into it. We have to do something about it.
Exactly, right. And especially here in New Mexico, all adults are mandated reporters when abuse is suspected, and so it's important to keep that in mind. But that's also it's a complex situation, right, where people are considering all the factors, or they're afraid to disrupt things, or not sure what's going to happen after a disclosure. But ultimately it's the child's safety that's at risk, and what we all need to be doing in order to protect and keep those kids safe. So I think another factor with this documentary, in addition to the offender being a family member, one of the people that was committing the acts of sexual abuse was someone who was very well respected in the community, right? It was somebody who was beloved in a religious setting, and well known. People knew who this person was. So I'm wondering if any of you, especially maybe Rebecca, you can share, when you are prosecuting a case like this and the person who has been accused of committing acts of sexual abuse against a child, how does that play out? What are some of the challenges that you see, and what do you do with that?
So these offenders get really, really good at grooming the community. They put themselves in a position to be quote unquote pillars of the community, so that partially, so it gives them access to kids, but also if they are ever caught, if a child ever does disclose, that child's less likely to be believed because they're the good guy. And so when I do have offenders that are in these high profile situations, we have to be a little more careful and cautious with the investigation and how we proceed with the case. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the reality, because what's going to happen is you're going to have a parade of people coming forward saying what a great guy this person is, and it puts a lot on a victim or on a group of victims to feel like it's them versus the rest of their community. And so we have to have really hard conversations with families about what's going to be best for the kids, and ultimately what's going to be best for the safety of the public.
Exactly. Yeah. And we just got a comment from one of our attendees saying that Sasha was confused because the perpetrator had just assaulted him, but then he's seeing his mom hugging this person and offering him a meal. And why would he tell in that situation if you're seeing the people that you trust in your life are treating this other person in a way that's because they don't know, and thinking that hey, this is, especially if it's a family member, but pillar of community. I really like the way you phrased that, Rebecca, that it was that it's a process of grooming the community. And so I think many of us are familiar with the term grooming when it comes to an individual, maybe setting up a child to put them in a position where they can take advantage and abuse someone. But the community grooming piece is something that I don't think gets a lot of discussion or attention. So thanks for bringing that up. Does anybody else want to share about how they handle it, or anything that comes up for you when you're working with kids or families in which the person who's committing the crime is someone who is well respected and is a person in the community. Angelica.
I think in my experience, that's a huge, obstacle that the child has to overcome. First of all, disclosing when they feel safe, and now the aftermath, right, of knowing, for example, if it's a teacher, religious leader, or someone, in a position of authority, they see it and they hear it. They even hear it. I've, interviewed multiple children where they hear conversation where, adults sometimes think that children or adolescents aren't paying attention to the conversations, but they really are. Even though they're playing with their toys or maybe in the other room, they could hear the conversations about, well, for example, that person can never do that, right? Or, look everything that they've done in the community. Look what a great teacher they are. They're, they help in all these areas, and they volunteer in this place or that place, or they give so much to the people in need. And now sometimes children will recant and say, see that they're not being believed by the community as a whole. And I think Rebecca put it perfectly, right? They're grooming not only the child and the family, but the community, and being able to have all these people behind you. I mean, I've seen it myself in actual trial where this person that was a pillar of this community had so many people behind them saying, this person could never do that, like defending this person's character, right? The alleged offender's character. And, think about it. If it's a 10-year-old little boy or little girl, who are you going to believe, right? We know, right? We know who we're going to believe. We're going to believe the children. But most people who aren't aware of how people react and how children disclose, and how sometimes when they're telling the story, that after the third time, like Rebecca was saying in trial, maybe the t-shirt that they're talking about that the person was wearing, instead of being green, it was blue-green, and there's slight inconsistencies, because that's how memory works when you're retelling a traumatic event. They might recant because now they have to face not only this person that did this crime on them or did these traumatic events on them, but also face everybody else that's standing behind them. And who do they have? Who is their support system? So I think that, us believing the child from the moment that they come into our office and letting them know, whether it's a 3-year-old up to age 17, for example, with children or even victims who, like Nick was saying, that, some adults are dealing with layers of trauma, letting them know that we are here to support them and be by their side.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good point. And I think Nick had mentioned that earlier, that there's, plenty of times where a child might disclose that something's going on, and the person they're disclosing to has also experienced sexual abuse as a child, or, later in life even. And it can be a really hard thing for a parent or a caregiver, or, whatever trusted adult is being told that by that child, that's now happening to them. And I think we saw that in the documentary too, which is what sort of propelled Sasha to come forward, knowing, or just having that sense that something was happening with his sister, and wanting to protect family. So yeah, that's definitely something that happens. Another thing that happened within the film is we saw Sasha, quote unquote, acting out after he had been subjected to abuse. So I think that's something that we hear about, like, oh, well, what are the signs of abuse and how can we tell and how do you know? And so I think many people don't necessarily think about, they see a child's so-called misbehaving, or, having behavioral issues, a lot of times it's called. Is that something that you see a lot in the work that you all are doing? And are there common signs of abuse that people should know about?
I can add to that. From my experience, when I meet with the families before the interview, I always have the guardians tell me, she always used to be outgoing, funny. She's always laughing with us. And now all of a sudden she just kind of hangs out in her room. She doesn't want to come out. She used to play sports. She don't play sports anymore. She don't like to go out for a movie or something. She kind of wants to hang out in her room and just stay home all the time. And before they always talk about her being, I'm just kind of using an example of a person who has been abused, laughing, outgoing, talkative, hanging out with friends, and all of a sudden just kind of hanging out in a room and excluding everybody, I'm sorry. So those are some of the behaviors, and majority of the kids that I interview too, they come in very quiet, shut down. But then after a while, I feel like once we get into the the disclosure process, I think the weight just kind of comes off of them, like they finally told their story. I think a lot of them kind of just hold it in so much, and then after the interview in the room, they're more comfortable and relaxed. That's from my experience, what I see on the behavioral side.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that you see a change in behavior, or the parents or the caregivers are noticing that there's been some sort of shift in how the child is behaving, and that, many times after disclosure, when something has happened, that child can feel that sense of relief after telling someone in a safe place. So that's maybe a little bit different than what we saw with Sasha, where people were maybe seeing some aggression or some outbursts and things like that, and then you might see it in another way in which you're describing a person who used to be outgoing and now is more withdrawn, and just seeing that behavior change. So it sounds like there's many different ways that it can manifest. Angelica?
To add a little bit to that, yes, absolutely. There's several different ways. I think, I'm a huge advocate for education, whether it's your children, nieces and nephews, family members that you might know, educating them about their body and what is safe with them, and who they can go to a safe adult to talk about, concerns that they may have. And it just depends on the child, right? You are spending more time with this child than us, of course, that we've just met your child, and you can see those signs, whether it's aggression like Melissa was saying, or what happened with Sasha. He was acting out in that form. I think in the documentary they mentioned something that also stuck to me, and it's very true. Children don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to put these things into words, so they're going to communicate just like a toddler, right? Going to communicate with how they know, with their behavior, acting out, or maybe isolating themselves. Different changes, maybe nightmares, or wetting the bed, or like aggression, more isolation on themselves, or maybe staying away from that person. Now, of course, because we mentioned these things that might come up, doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going through this type of abuse, but going back to talking to your children, or talking to your nieces or nephews, and educating them about their body, and letting them know that you are a safe adult. I think that's important to mention, because that way they feel good or feel okay going and speaking to you, and going to speaking with their children. And it's true, like a forensic interviewer, I know I speak for myself, but there's times where you have days where you don't want to do this work anymore, but you have those children that you can just see the moment that weight is lifted off their shoulders, or they'll even thank you and say thank you for listening to me. And that's our job as a forensic interviewer, and I'm sure Vanessa can agree to that we are here to listen to them, and kind of figure out what's going on with them, what happened. But they just, even how their facial expressions change, and just feel that sense of relief. I see that often, actually.
Yeah. So Nick, you're in more of a therapeutic role versus a forensic interviewer, which is a person who's there and specially trained in sort of a neutral setting to really just get at the heart of what happened. And there's not always a disclosure when forensic interviewers meet with kids when there's been a report of suspected abuse. But Nick, you're in a more position where you're there to provide therapeutic support, mental health supports. Are there things that you commonly hear from the people that you work with about this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, not in my role here at the Rape Crisis Center, but in previous positions where people would be bringing their children in for therapy services because like of a sudden behavior change, or acting out, all of those things that everyone has mentioned, or they're like, I need to get this kid on medication because they're just not paying attention in school. All of a sudden like it's something about a sudden shift, and they're like, oh, well, therapy or medication will fix this. And people forget that children's trauma responses look like ADHD. Like they can't pay attention, they can't sit still, they can't focus, their behavior's all over the place. And it's just automatic, oh, let's just, medicate or let's do something like that, instead of like, let's get to the root of where this is coming from. And I think that piece is super important for people to realize that if there's a sudden behavior change in a child, like there's got to be some like investigating into what happened, whether it's the parent, an active therapist that's really going to look at the full story and the full picture.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for that. So I think the other thing that comes to mind is with this documentary, we saw the outcomes of the criminal court cases. And that, I think, was sort of a, compelling moment in the film for a lot of people who viewed that, to see just the reality of what happens with a lot of these cases. So given that, I wanted to ask Rebecca if anything about that piece of it with the criminal court case, if that surprised you, or how do you see cases like this play out in New Mexico?
I was impressed. They convicted all three of them. That's very hard to do. It's very impressive. It's so tough in New Mexico because we're making these kids testify, and they have to testify in a lot of states, but in a lot of states they can put the kid on the stand and then just play the forensic interview. And unfortunately here in New Mexico, we can't do that. We also put kids through the pretrial interview process, which other states don't do. And that is probably, when I talk to kids, that's the hardest part for them. They can deal with the testifying, but it's that pretrial interview that really is tough for them. And so I was truly impressed that they got convictions on all three of them. I don't know that would happen here in New Mexico, just because, when we get to trial, I have to convince a jury to take this child's word over the adult. And it's heartbreaking when you get a not guilty and have to explain to that child that I never tell the kids that the jury didn't believe them, because I never want the kids to go through life thinking that. But the reality is that that's often what happens, is that the jury just didn't believe the child and acquitted.
Yeah, that's got to be hard for you to be in that position after you've done the work, and we're telling children, if something happens, you should tell a trusted adult, and a child has done all the right things, and there can still be that result. So I noticed that you mentioned that the more challenging part for a lot of kids is the pretrial interview. What makes that so difficult for kids compared to other parts of the process?
I can't really protect them during the pretrial interview. They can be asked questions in a pretrial interview that would not be allowed to be asked during trial. And that's especially teenagers, when I talk to them afterwards, that is often the hardest process for them, because they're being asked very, very intimate questions about not only their sexual abuse, but their sexual history. And that can be really, really difficult for them. So it's my lack of ability to protect them during a pretrial interview, I think, is the toughest part.
So there's not currently protections in New Mexico within our state system to be able to modify that practice, or to be able to protect kids in a better way?
So it's up to each individual judge. We can file motions to try and limit the types of questions that are asked during pretrial interviews. In my experience, those motions are not typically granted, and defense can ask pretty much whatever they want. And that's in my experience in Bernalillo County. In other jurisdictions, it might be different. But here in Albuquerque, that is the trend, is that during pretrial interviews, defense attorneys can essentially ask whatever questions they want in whatever manner they want.
I'm not obviously a prosecutor, but it's the same in Doña Ana County. And I can say that for myself as a forensic interviewer, and I'm an adult, right, has experience and is educated, and I feel confident in myself. But that PTI, that it is tough. It is really difficult. So I can imagine what a child having to go through that process, how difficult it would be for them.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like, for a child who's already been victimized by the abuser, by the abuse, and then to go through that can be really hard. And not only is it hard on the child, but I can imagine that it can be hard for the parents to see some of these outcomes as well. So, in the film, we heard about, some of the reactions because Sasha interviewed some family members about their recollections and their experiences. So, any of you, can you share some of the common reactions that you've seen from parents whose children have come forward and disclosed that they've been sexually abused?
Unfortunately, a common reaction from parents is, my kid is lying, or I don't believe my child. And I'm glad that Sasha did not have that experience, but a lot of kids do. And that's why it's so important for us as members of the CAC to really be there to support those kids, because these kids don't always have the support of their family. These cases sometimes turn into this child versus the family, and we'll be there in court and I'll look back and I see the defendant's side of the courtroom full of people and nobody, there for the child. And so that's just one of those just another barrier for these kids for just when they disclose. And then when they do disclose, if it does kind of tear the family apart, that sometimes leads to recantation, which I think Vanessa and Angelica talked a bit about as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a really hard situation. Angelica?
Yeah, just going back to what Rebecca was saying, I was kind of nervous to speak up about that because, it's the reality of things, right? That unfortunately, the most common reaction we have is parents don't believe the child. And it goes back to talking about the grooming process, right? This person who committed these acts, is such a great person and loving, and no one can imagine, something like this, that they would do something like this. But it's proven that when children are believed from the first onset of disclosure of an outcry, the whole healing process for them is a lot more successful than when they don't have supportive parents, or when they don't have people that are behind them. And it's true what Rebecca was saying. We see that where there's all these people behind with the offender or the defendant, backing them up and backing up their character, and they wouldn't do something like this. And here you have a small 10-year-old who has essentially nobody, essentially a few people behind them and supporting them.
That doesn't. Good, Nick.
No, I think one of the challenges that we run into, like as therapists too, is that we're working with a teen and they're doing their first disclosure with their therapist of some childhood abuse. We still have to call CYFD. We still have to make those mandated reporter calls, and the families get really upset with us. And we're always like working through that with the teen and, explaining why we have to do it and doing it with them. But the anger from the families, when like they've known about it, they just chose not to do anything about it, but we have to, and we will.
Yeah, that sounds like in that situation where you're trying to be both supportive of the teen, of the victim that you're working with the survivor, and then also following through with your requirements, right? As a mandated reporter, as a therapist in that role, and doing it in a way that is sort of a joint call, and preparing the family for what you're about to do when you make that report, and what all the next steps are after that. But the parents' reaction, sometimes that's from the work that I've done, that tends to stick with a survivor. They remember how someone reacts to them when they disclose. And I think that's important for all of us to remember too, and all those who are watching, when we read about things in the media, when we have people that we know that disclose sexual abuse to us or to people that we know, survivors are listening and they're hearing how we all are talking about, and what our reactions are. And that reaction may make or break a situation. It may prevent someone from coming forward, or it might give them the courage to come forward if they feel like you are a trusted person and to know that there is support and there's help. So yeah, it's whatever we can do to share how we can support people both in coming forward and to support their loved ones and their friends and family, and how to better react, or how to be there for the people that they love if something happens. Because it's whether we know it or not, we all know people that have gone through this, and it's may not be talked about, but it's something that there's survivors walking among us all the time and hearing and listening to how we're talking about these issues. So one thing I wanted to talk about too tonight, as we're coming towards the end, is in your experience, are there different barriers faced by children and families in New Mexico or in your community that you'd like to share that maybe look a little bit different from how it was portrayed in the film? Vanessa?
The barriers, can you explain more, like what you mean by barriers?
Well, just different scenarios that come up in the communities that you're working with, in terms of perhaps in rural New Mexico, or I know that you also work in tribal communities and Native communities. If you see different factors that maybe didn't get shown in the film with the types of cases that you work on.
Okay, thank you. So from the Hummingbird CAC that I work in, we serve Zuni, Pueblo, Navajo Nation, McKinley County, and Sheriff's Office. What I see is most of the children that I interview come from rural communities, tribal areas, and sometimes they come in using their native language. So that's a big factor. Some of them will identify their suspects as like their Che, their Nale, like in their language. Especially the rural areas, Hogan, sometimes it can happen in a Hogan setting, and sometimes people are like, what? From a different perspective, they can probably say, what is a Hogan? Like, but from mine, I understand it, what they're talking about. Smaller communities as well, like trying to seek help is very challenging. If there is an abuse that happened on a reservation, sometimes the family would have to travel maybe an hour or two just to get for medical needs. Like for example, our CAC, we are in Gallup, but some children come out as far as from Arizona on a Navajo Nation side, which is about maybe 2 to 3 hours. So those are some of the barriers and challenges I see within the families that we serve at our CAC.
Yeah, those are important to recognize, right? That there might be different languages that are preferred or most, fluent in terms of if someone's been traumatized, the language that is their first language tends to be the most comfortable language for a person to be speaking about that trauma. And so making sure that services are available in the languages that are requested by the victim and the family. And then you bring up a really important point especially for here in New Mexico. We're a huge state geographically, and thinking about how far people have to travel. And I know, Angelica, you in addition to working with kids in Doña Ana County, you have people that sometimes are traveling from, Silver City or Deming or other parts of southern New Mexico where people would have to travel quite a ways to get there. So I think that's an important factor. And then thinking about the size of the community and close-knit communities where, kind of like we were talking before about families and the pressure to perhaps not tell or to recognize that, it would be disruptive, or it would be something that would cause a big shift in how things go when you have small communities that are impacted by these things. So I don't know if Angelica, if you've seen that too in smaller communities that you're working in, where there's that factor that maybe we didn't see so much with Sasha's case.
Yes, because of, like you were saying, rural New Mexico, we have families traveling sometimes 2 hours to have a forensic interview conducted, or maybe a medical exam conducted as well. And that transportation issue, poverty issues as well, those are big barriers that come into play. Another thing with southern New Mexico, because we're so close to the border of, Mexico and the US, so sometimes there's immigration issues. So there's families that don't feel safe in reaching out. You might have a supportive parents that believe the child. However, they're scared and they're afraid that if they go to law enforcement, or they seek help from child protective services, how is that going to impact the family? And that in itself is a huge barrier for families in this area, where we kind of have to figure stuff out for them, and having to think outside the box when we need to in those rural communities. Another thing that I think is important to mention or to talk about barriers is culture, right? A lot of the times, and a lot of the cultures that we deal with in southern New Mexico, things that happen in the family, maybe the parents are believing and supportive. However, they have that mentality is that we deal with it as a family. It's a family issue. We're not going to seek out other resources outside of our family, and us as a family, we're going to deal with this together. So for example, you're not going to be around your uncle, and then we're going to do everything we can to avoid you being alone with this person, right? To avoid any other abuse to occur, because they have that mentality of just dealing with the situation within their family. So I think that's a huge barrier. We see that very often with the cultures in our community, as well as like religious cultures. I've dealt with multiple cases where, for example, they go to their elders, and it's not that the parents didn't believe the child. Again, it's they're doing what they think is best, right? Going to their elders of their church or their religious community. And then there's that barrier, right? Do we reach out to the authorities because maybe it's a leader in the religious community, maybe it's someone like we've been talking about, a pillar of that community? So do we reach to the outside authorities? So I think those are barriers that we do see in in our area in southern New Mexico.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that compares to the film as well with Sasha, that one of his abusers was part of a religious community. Nick, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna say one of the barriers I think that we run across quite a bit is the lack of providers that are trauma informed and ready to work with people that are survivors of sexual violence. Often we will get referrals from other therapists because the client or the child or the teen has brought up their sexual assault history, and it's just like this big red flag where they stop and they can't or won't deal with it. And so I just feel like that's a huge barrier, and one that's really easily resolved is if providers are willing to have the discussions and have the training and open their mind and their doors to work with people that need them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that even within the professional realm, that a lot of people are intimidated or not sure quite what to do when they have someone disclosing sexual abuse to them. And it's on professionals to get that training and education on how best to support whoever is coming to them with those issues, and to be presenting in a trauma informed way, so that the therapeutic process isn't going to make things worse, or just for people to have the courage to come forward and to want to disclose and to talk about and heal from their trauma, only to be faced with someone who maybe isn't informed on how to do it in a way that's going to be good for them. So I think, Nick, you brought up earlier, I think at the very beginning, that this documentary is essentially a manifestation of Sasha's healing, that he was able to use this creative outlet to transform his experience into something that he was able to heal from. So I'm wondering if you or anybody else has seen that type of example where kids who have gone through this type of child sexual abuse have been able to use it in a way, whether it's a creative pursuit or some sort of advocacy. If any of you would like to speak a little bit about that, the healing process. Go ahead.
I think one of the things that I have seen a lot of is teen groups and teens reaching out to organizations like ours to give back. And I think that there is some connection to that there, where they want to be an advocate and they want to have a voice and they want to help other people have a voice. I think that's definitely a manifestation of their own healing. Whether I know the complete details or not, I think the fact that they're willing to do that and actively seeking it out says a lot.
Absolutely. To go off a little bit from Nick there, I've seen this young child who I interviewed and is still going through the criminal justice process. But for Christmas, she raised money. She had like a bake sale. She baked all the things herself and then sold it. And then all the money that she raised, she bought all kinds of toys. And she didn't tell us that she was doing this. Again, this is someone that was younger than 10 years old, and went to the stores, bought like board games and dolls and trucks and all kinds of toys, and just showed up at our office and said, you guys helped. I get emotional just thinking about it. You guys helped me, so I'm going to help back. And I want kids, I know that there's kids out there that don't have toys for Christmas, so I want to give back. And she just dropped off this huge bunch of toys. And we were, of course, able to distribute those to our families in need. But just that healing process, she was supported from day one. She had parents that believed her, and it broke up her family, right? Because it was a family member. And she came through the CAC, had a forensic interview conducted. We got her connected to mental health services. She's still seeing, a therapist. Her parents are supportive in believing her. She's going through the criminal justice process, and it was part of her healing, being able to give back. And this was, again, someone that was younger than 10. And like Nick was saying, I mean, we see that quite often with teenagers that reach out and just want to give back, whether it's by, buying turkeys for Thanksgiving baskets or Christmas baskets or whatever it is. We have a lot of people that want to donate and give back, and they've been through our services. So absolutely.
Oh, I love that example. Thanks for sharing that. Vanessa?
From our experience, so our family advocate, she does a wonderful job. Her name is Verna Thomas. And after our interview process, she takes on the case of helping the families with services. And she goes far and beyond helping families. We had, especially during this pandemic time, we had some families in rural areas that don't have running water or electricity. So she's reached out so much about providing some water, some food. And a lot of families call her all the time, thanking her for her services, everything that she's done. Especially when it comes back to the forensic interview, I've interviewed a few children who were brave enough to disclose, and then come to find out their cousin sister also happened to them too. So just that courage, I think, and healing, they came up because the cousin sister disclosed. So they kind of gave him the courage, the confidence to come say, hey, this happened to me too, from the same suspect. So I think there's a lot of like healing process in ways, and also like trying to provide for the families at the same time. I think we have a lot of those in our CAC.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think you're right, especially with the pandemic, there's a lot of other issues that are happening and affecting families. And so to be able to help out and to see kids in that position too, where they're either inspired by someone else that has come forward, or they themselves are in a position where they feel like they want to give back, and to have the role of the advocate too, to be there to assist with that is super important. So I see we're running out of time. So if any of you have any closing thoughts or messages that you'd like to share for adults who either suspect that a child is being abused, or adults who have a child that discloses abuse to them, or if adults are watching and they themselves are survivors of childhood abuse, if any of you have any parting thoughts or words to share with our audience.
If a child discloses to you, or you think a child is being abused, report it. It's better to be wrong than to not say anything, and this child continues to be abused. So if you see something or you're worried about something, say something.
Thanks for that. Yeah, we'll be sharing the number also for CYFD for where you would make that report. Angelica?
a child discloses, believe them. Believe them, let them know that you're there to support them. And, you know, if you're an adult that is a survivor and maybe hasn't reached out to talk to anybody, there's multiple resources where we can help you wherever you're at in the state of New Mexico, right? Reach out, and you have a huge support system behind you, and we will meet you where you're at.
Nick?
I would say that it's never too late to start the healing process. So even though it's scary, like it's okay to take that leap and go to the supports that are there for you.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's powerful. Vanessa?
Just like Nick said, it's never too late for the healing process. If a child discloses to you about anything abuse, report it. Believe your child. Believe the child that is telling you. There are services that are there to help the families. Even for Native families, if you believe in the traditional practice healing, there is that route too for it.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's not a one size fits all healing process, that's for sure. But there is support available, and to be able to, at least, you know, if you do have a suspicion, to be able to report that and let the investigation take its course. And it's you know, better to be safe, because we want our kids to be safe. So with that, I think we are wrapping up for this evening. So thank you all to our panelists, to our behind the scenes support with Alexandra and Jade from the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, providing the technical support, all of my coalition colleagues, to Stella Gallegos, who was able to reach out and get a copy of the film. If anybody was not able to view the link, you can feel free to reach out and we can share that with you. And other than that, we will say goodbye for this evening. And to those of you on the recording, we're so happy you watched, and those of you who caught us live, yay, we made it. We survived our first Facebook Live for many of us. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.